The fluorescent lights buzzed harshly above me as I stared at the severance package, 25 years condensed into a manila folder. I'm Franklin Hargrove, 58, internal controller. My father's pocket watch ticked steadily in my hand, its polished surface catching the light. 5 days from my pension, and they thought I'd just walk away. But some clocks don't stop without a fight. Have you ever been pushed out just when you were about to make it? The rain was tapping rhythmically on the window of my office, tiny droplets running down the glass like tears I refused to shed. I stared blankly at the cardboard box resting on my desk, an unceremonious coffin for 25 years of dedication. My name, Franklin Hargrove, was scrawled in thick black marker on the side, just above the company's logo that I had once worn with pride. 25 years, reduced to a handful of personal belongings. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with a sterile hum, flickering occasionally as if they too were on their last legs. My father's pocket watch rested on the edge of the desk, its polished silver surface reflecting the cold white light. It ticked steadily, mocking the fleeting nature of time, each tick a reminder of every hour, every minute I had given to this place. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the smooth metal, the familiar chill sinking into my skin. It had been with me since my first day at Stonemont Industries. I remembered standing in front of those towering concrete walls, fresh out of college, full of ambition and conviction that I would make a difference. My father had pressed the watch into my hands that morning, his eyes heavy with both pride and the weight of years. "Time is your most valuable asset, son," he had said. "Don't let anyone steal it from you." But here I was, standing on the brink of forced retirement, time slipping away faster than I could hold on to it. I hadn't seen it coming. Not after all these years. Not after the late nights, the weekends spent combing through financial reports and auditing processes, making sure every cent was accounted for. I had always been diligent, some might say obsessive, but I called it integrity, and I had assumed, perhaps naively, that integrity mattered. The door creaked open behind me, its hinges groaning in protest. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. The soft click of heels against the tile grew louder, stopping just short of my desk. "Franklin." Janet's voice was soft, almost apologetic. I turned then, slowly, and met her eyes. They were rimmed red, lids puffy. She had been crying. That was never a good sign. "They want to see you in David's office," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain outside. Her hands were clutching a manila envelope to her chest, fingers trembling slightly. I gave her a nod, slipping the watch into my coat pocket. Its weight was reassuring, familiar. I followed Janet through the narrow hallways of Stonemont, past rows of empty cubicles, past the break room where I'd spent countless mornings with lukewarm coffee and dry bagels. The lights overhead flickered as we walked, casting long shadows that wavered and danced along the linoleum. David Langston's office door was already ajar, the soft hum of his voice trickling into the hallway. Janet paused, glancing back at me with an expression that bordered on pity. "You're not the only one, Franklin," she whispered, eyes darting to the manila envelope clutched in her arms. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the floor, the sound fading until there was only silence. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. David Langston was sitting behind his desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the monitor in front of him. He didn't bother to look up. "Franklin," he began, his voice monotone and detached. "Have a seat." I remained standing. David's eyes flickered up, meeting mine for the briefest of moments before flitting back to his screen. His fingers tapped against the keyboard with the kind of practiced indifference only a man well-versed in corporate execution could master. "I won't waste your time," he said finally, sliding a folder across the desk. I watched as it glided smoothly, coming to a halt just before me. His manicured finger tapped it once, then retracted as if it carried some infectious disease. "Budget restructuring." The words hung in the air, suspended between us. I let them settle, unmoving. Budget restructuring. I'd heard the term before, soft language for cutting dead weight. I didn't reach for the folder. "Restructuring," I repeated, my voice even. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs casually. His eyes finally met mine. "Your department is expendable, Franklin. Compliance isn't what it used to be. We're streamlining." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Compliance wasn't what it used to be. I'd spent the last 2 decades ensuring that every report, every audit, every single piece of documentation met federal standards. I'd flagged discrepancies, reported potential fraud, and watched as they were brushed under the rug with surgical precision. "Streamlining," I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. David's smile was thin. "You'll have until the end of the day to collect your things. Janet will provide you with the necessary paperwork." I nodded, more out of reflex than agreement. My hand reached into my coat pocket, fingers wrapping around the cold metal of the pocket watch. Its ticking grew louder in my mind, a metronome counting down the seconds of my career. I turned on my heel, not waiting for further explanation. I had heard enough. As I stepped out into the hallway, Janet was waiting, the cardboard box already prepared. Her eyes were glassy, hands trembling as she handed it to me. "I'm so sorry, Franklin," she whispered, voice cracking. "It's not right." I placed the box on the nearest table and began the mechanical process of packing up 25 years of memories. A photograph of Evelyn and me at the company picnic in '97. A plaque commemorating 15 years of service. The potted plant my daughter Samantha had given me for my birthday, now slightly wilted from neglect. As I loaded the last of my things, I noticed a list pinned to the corkboard near Janet's desk. Names, at least a dozen of them, each crossed out with a thin red line. I recognized some of them. All of them were close to their pension dates. I glanced back at Janet. She met my eyes, then looked away. I slipped the pocket watch from my coat, its ticking steady, unyielding. I stood there, rain pouring down outside, the lights flickering overhead, and I felt something shift inside me. I took one last look at David's office window, where he stood with the phone pressed to his ear, a smile stretching across his face. He laughed, unrestrained, loud, confident. It was never about the budget. My hand tightened around the watch, the cold metal biting into my skin. I walked out into the rain, the drops soaking through my coat, mingling with the chill of the watch pressed against my chest. "This isn't over," I whispered to myself, as the rain continued to fall. The rain had stopped, but the sense of betrayal lingered like a stain I couldn't scrub away. My coat, still damp from the downpour, hung lifelessly over the back of the chair in my small, cluttered home office. Papers were strewn across the surface of the desk, stacks of invoices, audit reports, financial statements, each one marked with my own meticulous handwriting. I had always prided myself on detail, the ability to see what others missed. Now, that very skill was gnawing at me, whispering that I had missed something far greater than a simple error. I settled into the worn leather chair, its springs groaning under my weight, and pulled out the stack of emails I had printed over the years. Most were routine, weekly reports, compliance updates, but one, in particular, caught my eye. It was from March 2019, highlighted in yellow. Discrepancies found in pension fund calculations. Urgent review needed. My fingers traced the edge of the paper, smudging the ink slightly where rainwater had dripped from my coat earlier. I remembered sending it to David Langston, attaching a full report, itemizing every inconsistency I had found. I even remembered his response, a curt, "Noted. We will review internally." That was the last I heard of it. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. How many times had I reported irregularities? How many memos had I sent up the chain, only for them to be ignored or brushed aside? It had been a pattern, one I had been too blind to see, or perhaps too trusting. I opened the fireproof box beneath my desk, the key turning with a satisfying click. Inside, the smell of old paper and dust greeted me. I pulled out folders marked with dates going back to 2017. Evelyn had once teased me about my obsession with record-keeping, but now I was grateful for every dog-eared corner, every underlined phrase. Spreading the documents out across the desk, I began to piece together the puzzle. Each folder told a story, but not the one Stonemont Industries had published in its quarterly earnings reports. This story was filled with deletions, adjustments, and, most alarmingly, terminations. Names began to emerge, familiar ones: William Pruitt, Sharon McCabe, Douglas Lane. All had been let go within months of nearing their pension eligibility, all under the pretense of budget restructuring. I flipped through the pages, my hands moving faster now. Each name corresponded with an adjustment in the budget. Each adjustment correlated with a rise in reported profit margins. I leaned back, my hands shaking slightly. This wasn't restructuring. This was calculated. The phone buzzed on my desk, jolting me back to the present. Samantha's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before picking up. "Dad, are you all right?" Her voice was laced with concern, and I could almost picture her brow furrowing, just as Evelyn's used to. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a steadiness into my voice. "Just going through some old files." There was a pause. "I saw the news," she said softly. "You didn't tell me." "Didn't seem worth mentioning," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Besides, I've been through worse." Samantha sighed, the kind of sigh that only comes from knowing your father too well. "If you need me to come out there—" "No need," I interrupted, glancing at the pile of papers now scattered across my desk. "I'm handling it." Another pause, this one heavier. Finally she spoke. "Okay, but call me if you change your mind." I promised I would, though we both knew I wouldn't. Samantha had her own life, her own responsibilities. I wasn't about to burden her with mine. I ended the call and returned to the stack of papers, but my mind was still spinning. I needed confirmation, something concrete. I picked up the phone and dialed Janet's extension from memory. It rang 3 times before her familiar, hesitant voice answered. "Hello?" "Janet, it's Franklin." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the whisper of breath on the other end. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I could almost hear her shifting uncomfortably. "All right. The people who've been let go in the past 5 years, was it just coincidence, or were they all nearing pension?" There was silence, long and heavy. Finally, she whispered, "You're not the only one, Franklin." My grip tightened on the phone. "How many?" Her voice trembled. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 20, 30, more? They never said why, just restructuring. But the names, they all had seniority. They all were close." I closed my eyes, nodding to myself as if the confirmation was something I'd been expecting all along. "Thank you, Janet," I said quietly. "That's all I needed to know." I set the phone down gently, my hand shaking just enough to make the receiver rattle. My gaze drifted back to the desk, the files still laid out like pieces of a crime scene. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. I pulled the pocket watch from my coat pocket, its ticking a steady metronome in the silence of the room. I watched the second hand tick, each movement deliberate and unyielding. Time had always been my ally, but now it felt like my enemy. I gathered the documents into a single stack, smoothing the edges before tucking them back into the fireproof box. But just as I was about to close the lid, my eyes caught the edge of a folded memo near the bottom. I pulled it out carefully. The paper was creased and slightly yellowed, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. David Langston. The subject line read, "Budget realignments for fiscal year 2021. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines obscuring entire paragraphs. But one line remained visible, underlined with a firm stroke. Proposed terminations to achieve cost efficiency. My breath hitched. This wasn't restructuring. This was a purge. I stared at the pocket watch, its ticking growing louder in the silence of my office. My grip tightened around it, the cold metal pressing against my palm. "They think they can bury this," I muttered, my voice trembling with rage. "Not this time." The smell of bacon and fresh coffee greeted me as I stepped into Hargrove's diner, Gregory's usual spot. The place hadn't changed in years. Leather booths still bore the cracks of time, chrome finishes dulled by decades of greasy fingerprints, and the jukebox in the corner sat quietly, its neon lights long since faded. I half expected to hear Elvis crackle to life, but it stayed silent, just as it had for the past decade. Gregory was already there, hunched over a cup of black coffee, steam curling around his face like whispers of old memories. His fingers tapped idly on a stack of manila folders beside him. He glanced up as I approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," he said, voice rough like gravel. "Been a long week," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. The seat squeaked under my weight, and I couldn't help but smile. Some things never changed. Gregory pushed the cup of coffee across the table. "You're gonna need this." I took a sip, the bitter warmth seeping through my chest, grounding me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation filled the silence. Finally, Gregory leaned back, eyes fixed on mine. "So," he began, "Janet told me you've been digging." I nodded, setting the cup down. "I found discrepancies, Greg. Pension fund manipulations, terminations lined up perfectly with vesting dates. It wasn't restructuring. It was calculated." His eyes sharpened, fingers stopping their idle tapping. "I told you this would happen, didn't I?" "You did," I admitted, remembering our last conversation in this very diner 2 years ago. Back then, he had hinted at financial anomalies, subtle enough to be dismissed, but persistent. I didn't want to believe it. Stonemont had been my life's work. "And now you believe me," he continued, not as a question, but as a statement. He reached for the stack of folders, sliding them across the table. The worn edges brushed against my fingers, and I pulled them closer. "These are just the beginning," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I tried to call it out before I left. No one wanted to listen. I opened the first folder. Inside were spreadsheets, email printouts, memos, all stamped with Stonemont's logo, dates, amounts, approval signatures. My eyes scanned the columns, each one more damning than the last. "They've been cooking the books for years," Gregory continued, his gaze fixed on me, And it's not just pensions, it's contracts, supply chains, tax filings. David was just the latest puppet. This goes deeper than you think. I closed the folder and looked up at him. How deep? Gregory leaned forward, his hands clasped together. Deep enough that if you want to take them down, you're going to need more than just a few emails. The SEC won't act on suspicion. They need evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words press down on me. I'll gather everything I have. Every document, every email, every financial report. He smiled for the first time since I sat down, a grim sort of satisfaction. That's what I wanted to hear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was plain white, nothing more than his name, and a number embossed in simple black ink. But it was the handwriting on the back that caught my attention. Don't call me. I'll call you. I raised an eyebrow, but he merely shrugged. Trust me, it's safer that way. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what lay ahead settling over us. Finally, Gregory slid out of the booth, his joints creaking as he stood. Finish your coffee, he said, nodding toward the cup in front of me. You're going to need it. I watched as he left, the bell above the door chiming softly. The diner settled back into its rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing just outside its greasy windows. I sat there for a long time, fingers brushing over the surface of the business card. My mind drifted back to Stonemont's boardroom, to David's smirk, to the names crossed out in red ink on Janet's list. When I finally stood, I slipped the card into my coat pocket, right next to my father's pocket watch. It ticked steadily against my chest, its rhythm almost reassuring. I stepped outside, the afternoon sun filtering through the clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement. I paused for a moment, glancing back through the diner's window. Gregory was still sitting there, cup in hand, eyes locked on the entrance. He raised his mug slightly, almost like a toast. I nodded back, slipping my hands into my coat pockets. The watch ticked once, twice, steady as always. I'll be ready, I whispered to myself, my breath curling in the cool spring air. And I knew I would be. The letter was waiting for me on my porch, sealed with the Stonemont logo. The envelope was thick, the kind of thickness that promised compensation for silence. Janet's words echoed in my mind. If they send you a letter, it's not a good sign. She wasn't wrong. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the way hush money always carried a kind of heaviness, as if the ink itself was burdened with secrets. The air was thick with early summer humidity, clinging to my skin as I stood there on the creaking steps of my front porch. Paint peeled off the banister in long strips, curling like the brittle pages of an old book. I slid my thumb under the seal, the adhesive cracking with a sound that felt far louder than it should have. Inside, neatly folded and pressed, lay a non-disclosure agreement. The language was precise, surgical in its clarity. 3 months of severance, continued healthcare coverage for a year, and a generous compensation package, all in exchange for my silence. A single line, highlighted in yellow, stood out from the rest. Any disclosure of company practices, both past and present, will result in immediate forfeiture of all benefits. I stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring slightly as my grip on the paper tightened. They wanted me quiet. They wanted it all to disappear. I folded the papers back into the envelope, setting it down on the wooden table beside the front door. My hand instinctively reached into my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the cool metal of my father's watch. Its ticking was steady, reliable. I pulled it out, holding it in my palm, feeling its weight. A far more honest weight than what Stonemont was offering. I went inside and dialed Janet's number. It rang twice before her familiar voice came through, breathless and hushed. "Hello?" "They sent me the agreement," I said, skipping pleasantries. There was a pause, long and heavy. "They're doing it to everyone," she whispered finally. "Everyone close to vesting." "And they're signing?" Another pause. "Most of them. Yes." My grip on the phone tightened. I could almost hear her look over her shoulder, the paranoia seeping through the line. "You didn't sign, did you?" "Not yet," I replied. Her sigh of relief was almost audible. "Don't," she said firmly. "Franklin, don't sign it. If you do, they win." "What happens if I don't?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Janet hesitated. "They'll make your life hell." I chuckled bitterly. "A bit late for that, don't you think?" There was a moment of silence before she spoke again, softer this time. "Just be careful. They don't like loose ends." I thanked her and hung up, setting the receiver back on its cradle with deliberate care. The letter sat untouched on the table, glaring back at me with its thinly veiled threats. I barely had time to consider my next move when the doorbell rang. Its chime was sharp and sudden, slicing through the stillness of the room. I looked through the peephole, already knowing who it would be. David Langston stood on my porch, hands clasped neatly in front of him, his suit immaculate as always. His smile was thin and practiced, the kind of smile one wears to funerals and board meetings. I opened the door just wide enough to see his eyes narrow slightly. "Afternoon, Franklin," he began, voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Thought I'd stop by and see if you got our little package." "I got it," I replied, not moving from the doorway. David's smile widened. Good, good. I wanted to make sure you understood the terms. It's a very generous offer." His eyes flickered to the envelope on the table behind me. "You sign that, and you walk away comfortable." "More than comfortable." "And if I don't?" I asked. David's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder. "If you don't, things might get complicated." "Complicated how?" I stepped forward slightly, closing the gap between us. David's hands slipped into his pockets, his shoulders relaxing as if he were discussing the weather. "Well, you know how these things go, Franklin. Audits get messy, legal fees pile up, retirement benefits get tangled in red tape." He shrugged. "Nothing personal, just business." I felt the weight of the pocket watch in my hand, its ticking steady against my palm. I met his gaze, unblinking. "I'm not signing." David's smile flickered, just for a moment, before he composed himself. "Think about it," he said, adjusting his tie. "I'll be in touch." He turned and walked back down the steps, his shoes clicking against the concrete. I watched him go, rain beginning to sprinkle from the thick clouds above, streaking the window with trails of water. David stepped into his car, giving me one last look before shutting the door. I closed the door firmly, the echo of it reverberating through the quiet of the house. My hand was still clenched around the pocket watch, its metal cool against my skin. But as I stepped away, it slipped from my grasp, tumbling through the air before striking the hardwood floor. A crack splintered across its surface, delicate but unmistakable. I knelt down, picking it up gently. My thumb traced the jagged line, the tick now softer, almost hesitant. I held it for a long moment, the silence of the house pressing in around me. David wanted me quiet. Stonemont wanted me quiet. But they had misjudged me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday morning, crisp and official, with the SEC's seal embossed on the header. I held it in my hands, the paper heavier than I expected, as if the weight of justice was etched into its fibers. The lettering was sharp and definitive. No room for negotiation, no hesitation. I traced my finger over the words. Subpoena ducis tecum. They wanted documents, financial records, ledgers, everything related to Stonemont's pension fund and restructuring measures. This was it. This was the beginning. I slipped it back into the envelope and slid it into my briefcase. The morning sun glared off the glass windows of the SEC headquarters as I pulled into the parking lot. Midsummer heat pressed against the asphalt, shimmering waves blurring the edges of the building. Inside, the air was cool and sterile. Glass partitions lined the hallways, offering glimpses of hushed conversations and the soft glow of computer screens. Gregory was waiting for me in the lobby, leaning against a pillar, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather strap of his watch. He nodded as I approached, pushing himself upright. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. "As I'll ever be," I replied. We rode the elevator up in silence, the hum of machinery filling the space between us. Woman with sharp glasses and a folder clutched to her chest stood beside me, her knuckles white against the manila. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw it there. Fear. Or perhaps recognition. The door slid open with a soft chime, and we stepped into the heart of the SEC. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the endless rows of cubicles and glass-walled offices. Gregory led the way, nodding politely to a security guard who waved us through. At the far end of the hall, a nameplate read, Michael Levine, Senior Investigator. Gregory knocked once, and a voice beckoned us inside. Levine was seated behind a desk cluttered with stacks of binders and open folders. He looked up as we entered, his sharp eyes flicking between us. "Gentlemen," he began, standing and extending a hand. His grip was firm, eyes unblinking. "I assume you have what I need," he continued, gesturing to the briefcase I carried. I nodded, placing it on the desk and popping the latches. Inside, folders sat neatly stacked, labeled and organized. Emails, ledger records, pension discrepancies. Everything I had been collecting for years, now ready to see the light of day. Levine wasted no time, flipping through the first folder with quick, practiced movements. His eyes scanned each page, lips pressed into a thin line. Occasionally he would nod or mutter under his breath before moving on to the next document. "This is comprehensive," he remarked finally, looking up at me. "You documented all of this yourself?" "Over the past 4 years," I replied, my voice steady. "I sent reports, memos. None of it went anywhere." Levine leaned back, fingers steepled. "That stops now. We'll begin immediate analysis. I need copies of everything." I handed him the USB drive Janet had slipped to me just the night before. Her hands had trembled as she pressed it into my palm, whispering, "These are the emails, board members, cost-saving measures. It's all there." Levine raised an eyebrow as he took it. "This from a reliable source?" "You could say that," I replied. He slid the drive into his computer, his eyes flicking across the screen as files began to populate. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft click of his mouse. Finally, Levine straightened. "This is enough to issue a subpoena for Stonemont's internal records. If what's on here is valid, they're in deep trouble." Gregory leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a satisfied grin playing at the edges of his mouth. "I always knew they'd slip up," he murmured. Levine didn't smile. His fingers tapped against the desk rhythmically, eyes still on the screen. "We move today. I want agents at Stonemont's headquarters by this afternoon. All financial records are to be seized and secured. If there's evidence of tampering, we'll find it." Just as he finished speaking, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Franklin Hargrove," I said cautiously. The voice on the other end was low, crackling with static. "They're going to destroy evidence this weekend. You need to act fast." I straightened in my chair. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "A friend, trust me. You don't have much time?" The line went dead. I stared at the phone, its screen blinking back at me, waiting for a response that would never come. I looked up at Gregory and Levine. "We need to move quicker than you think," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Levine raised an eyebrow. "Quicker? How much quicker?" "By tomorrow," I replied, sliding my phone back into my pocket. "If we wait, they'll bury everything." Levine didn't argue. He simply nodded and picked up his desk phone, barking orders to unseen subordinates. Gregory watched him for a moment before turning back to me. "Looks like you've kicked the hornet's nest," he said, his grin now fully formed. I didn't smile back. I was already thinking ahead, eyes locked on the crack in my father's pocket watch as I slipped it from my pocket. The crack had widened, splintering out like a spider web. Time was running out, and I knew I had just declared war. The boardroom was silent as the SEC investigators unrolled the projector screen. The first slide displayed a familiar name: David Langston. His photograph stared back at us, all confidence and polished veneer, but beneath it lay numbers, dates, and transactions that told a very different story. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Heat waves shimmered outside, distorting the view of the cityscape. But inside, the tension was stark and palpable. My hands rested calmly on the stack of documents in front of me, the USB drive still heavy in my coat pocket. It felt like a ticking time bomb against my chest. Michael Levine stood at the front, eyes sharp and unyielding. He clicked the remote, and the next slide appeared, a timeline stretching back 5 years, highlighting cost-saving layoffs, pension reallocation, and contractual adjustments. Every bullet point was marked with dates that matched the terminations I had uncovered. "We begin with the first series of layoffs in 2019, Michael started, his voice crisp and measured. "As you can see, there is a direct correlation between projected financial losses and the strategic elimination of long-term employees nearing pension eligibility." The room was still, not a cough, not a whisper. Executives leaned forward, fingers tented beneath chins, eyes narrowing as each line of data was presented. Patricia Donovan sat at the far end, arms crossed tightly, her gaze locked on the screen. Michael continued, clicking to the next slide. It was an email chain. David Langston's name plastered across the header, his signature bold and distinct. The words were clear. "Further cost optimizations recommended. Pension funds can be adjusted accordingly to maximize quarterly gains." A murmur rippled through the room. Gregory, seated beside me, gave the slightest nod of satisfaction. He had seen it coming long before I did. Now, Michael turned to face the room. "We have additional documentation submitted by Mr. Hargrove." His hand extended towards me, palm open. "Franklin, if you wouldn't mind." I stood, slipping the USB from my coat pocket and placing it into Michael's hand. He inserted it into the projector's port, and the screen flickered to life with a new series of emails, more explicit this time. Messages between David and members of the board, discussing terms like optimization and restructuring, though the subtext was clear. These communications, Michael explained, illustrate a deliberate attempt to circumvent pension obligations by terminating employees prior to vesting periods. This is not budgetary prudence, it's systemic manipulation. I glanced across the table to where David sat, his hands folded neatly, knuckles white against the surface. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the screen, jaw clenched. "This is absurd," he finally spat, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the hardwood, the sound echoing sharply. These documents are doctored. None of this is real. It's a smear campaign from a disgruntled former employee. His gaze turned to me, sharp and accusing. You're behind this, Franklin. I always knew you'd try something desperate. I didn't flinch. My fingers rested lightly on the pocket watch in my coat, its ticking a steady reminder of what was real. Those documents were subpoenaed directly from Stonemont's servers, Michael replied coolly. Unaltered, verified through multiple channels. David's mouth opened, then shut. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but found none. Patricia Donovan leaned forward, her fingers tapping slowly against the table. Mr. Langston, she began, her voice cutting through the silence. Do you have anything of substance to counter these claims? David stammered, his composure unraveling. This is manipulation. It's all fabricated. He's trying to take me down. Patricia's eyes were cold. Then why? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Did every termination align perfectly with pension vesting dates? Why did cost-saving measures only affect senior employees? Are you saying the SEC fabricated those records too? David's face flushed, the tendons in his neck straining. I need my lawyer, he managed, his voice cracking. That, Michael interrupted, nodding to the back of the room, won't be necessary. Two agents stepped forward, suits pressed and expressions unreadable. They moved with practiced ease, hands slipping into their pockets to retrieve a pair of handcuffs. David Langston, Michael announced, voice firm. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, manipulation of pension funds, and obstruction of federal investigation. David took a step back, hands rising instinctively. You can't do this, he hissed, eyes wide. I'm the CFO. The agents didn't respond. The handcuffs clicked into place with finality, the metal catching the light in brief, sharp glints. The boardroom was utterly silent except for the faint hum of the projector still illuminating his name across the wall. As they let him out, his eyes found mine. They were wild, desperate, brimming with a rage I had seen once before, the kind that flares when control slips through one's fingers. He sneered, lips curling back. You think this is over? You'll regret this, Franklin. You'll regret it. I didn't respond. I watched as he was led through the glass doors, his shoes tapping hollowly against the marble floors. The projector flickered off, the lights humming back to full strength. Around me, board members whispered in hushed tones, heads bowed together in disbelief. My hand slipped into my coat pocket, fingers brushing the cracked surface of my father's. Watch. The fissure had spread, splintering outwards like spider webs. I held it tightly, feeling its tick resonate against my fingertips. Time, I thought, is catching up. The office looked different when I returned. Brighter, somehow. The walls, once adorned with gray panels and fluorescent glare, now shimmered with new paint and sunlight streaming through larger windows. The renovations were subtle but meaningful. More glass partitions, open meeting spaces, and a reception desk that actually welcomed visitors instead of screening them. Transparency, Patricia had called it. I stepped inside, feeling the weight of months of turmoil finally lifting. There were nods of acknowledgement as I passed familiar faces, some hesitant, others proud. Janet was the first to approach, her smile broader than I had ever seen it. Welcome back, Franklin, she said, her voice steady. It's good to see you. Good to be back, I replied, squeezing her hand gently. It's been a long road. She chuckled, her eyes glimmering with something that resembled hope. You've done a lot of good, you know, she said, glancing around the room. Things are changing. Real change, not just on paper. I nodded, my gaze drifting to the glass walls of the boardroom where Patricia Donovan stood, phone pressed to her ear, her fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface of the table. She caught my eye, ending the call and waving me in. The door swung open with a whisper, and I stepped inside. Patricia moved around the desk, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and sincere. "We need you to help rebuild," she said, eyes steady. I raised an eyebrow. "Rebuild?" "Ethics and Integrity Council," she continued, her voice resolute. "We're implementing structural changes, transparency measures, regular audits, third-party oversight, but it needs someone with experience and conviction." I glanced out the window, the sunlight reflecting off the neighboring buildings, casting prisms of light across the room. "And you think that's me?" "I know it's you," she replied, her eyes unwavering. "You exposed what no one else dared to. You saw what others ignored. If we're going to do this right, I want you leading it." I considered her words, the weight of them settling in my mind. For so long, I had fought against corruption, clawing through ledgers and audit trails in isolation. Now, they were offering me a seat at the table, a chance to change things from the inside. "I'll do it," I said finally, the decision feeling as natural as breathing. "But we do it right. No half measures." Patricia smiled, her grip tightening for just a moment before she released my hand. "That's the only way I know," she replied. The leaves had turned gold and crimson by the time Grace Community Church held its annual Harvest Festival. The grounds were dotted with stalls selling homemade pies, cider simmering in great iron pots, and children laughing as they chased each other through piles of fallen leaves. It was the kind of simple joy that had always grounded me. Samantha stood beside me, her arm looped through mine. "You look happy, Dad," she said, her eyes sparkling in the sunlight. "I am," I replied, watching as the community gathered, faces bright with optimism. "It's been a long time since I've seen this place so alive." Her hand squeezed mine gently. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "for everything." Before I could respond, a bell rang out, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. I stepped forward, the small stage creaking under my weight. The microphone crackled to life as I cleared my throat. "Thank you all for being here," I began, the crowd quieting instantly. "Today isn't just about celebration. It's about renewal, about building back what was taken from us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I glanced over at Gregory, standing near the cider stand, his hands in his pockets, a grin stretching across his face. He nodded once, and I continued. "I'd like to introduce something very special," I said, unfolding the paper in my hand. "Evelyn's Promise, a scholarship fund dedicated to the children of laid-off employees from Stonemont Industries. It's a commitment to ensure that their futures are not dictated by the mistakes of the past." Applause erupted, loud and unrestrained. I felt my chest swell with pride as I looked out over the faces of those who had been wronged, now standing together in solidarity. I saw Janet, near the back, tears glimmering in her eyes. I stepped down from the stage, feeling the weight of my father's watch press against my chest. Its familiar ticking was steady and strong, no longer fractured or uncertain. I pulled it from my pocket, cradling it in my hand. The crack that had once splintered across its surface was gone, replaced by a smooth, polished finish. It ticked smoothly, every second precise and confident. "You fixed it," Samantha whispered beside me, her eyes wide with surprise. I smiled, holding it up to the light. "I guess some things are worth mending," I replied. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the church lawn, I felt a hand clap firmly against my back. I turned to see Gregory, his grin wider than ever. "You did good, Franklin," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that felt unyielding. Real good. It's not just me, I replied, glancing back at the crowd. It's all of us. Gregory nodded, his eyes glimmering with something close to pride. He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. This is just the beginning, he said, his tone resolute. I looked down at the watch, its ticking steady and unbroken. Time had always been my measure of truth, and now it was finally on my side. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church as I watched the children line up for their scholarships. Their eyes shone with hope and possibility, their hands clutched tightly around envelopes embossed with the name Evelyn's Promise. Snow blanketed the church grounds in a soft layer of white, muffling the sounds of footsteps and lending an almost sacred stillness to the morning. I stood at the front, Samantha by my side, her hand resting gently on my arm. You did it, Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I glanced down at her, catching the glimmer of pride in her eyes. I squeezed her hand in response, too overwhelmed to speak. I took a deep breath and stepped forward to the podium. The crowd fell silent, eyes turning towards me with a reverence I had never imagined. I cleared my throat, the microphone crackling softly. Today, I began, my voice steady, we honor the memory of someone who believed that every moment mattered. Evelyn understood that time isn't just something we live through, it's something we build with. My eyes drifted to the far end of the room, where a glass display case stood proudly. Inside, polished to a shine, was my father's pocket watch. Its surface gleamed under the soft light, the crack now mended, its ticking rhythmic and sure. It had become the symbol of Evelyn's promise, a reminder that time, when used with integrity, had the power to heal. This scholarship fund is not just for education, I continued, my voice growing stronger. It's a promise that time will not be stolen from those who deserve it, that every child, regardless of circumstance, will have the opportunity to build a future with dignity and hope. The applause was soft at first, a gentle ripple that grew steadily, building to a wave of approval. I stepped back from the podium, nodding to the row of children waiting patiently, their smiles bright against the backdrop of snow-dusted windows. Samantha handed me a folded letter, its edges crisp and clean. It's from one of the recipients, she explained, her voice soft. I opened it carefully, the handwriting slanted and neat. Dear Mr. Hargrove, I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. My dad used to work at Stonemont. When he lost his job, everything changed for us. But because of you and Evelyn's promise, I'm going to college next year. I promise to make it count. Thank you for believing in us. My throat tightened as I folded the letter back up, slipping it into my coat pocket. I looked out over the crowd, catching glimpses of familiar faces. Janet with her daughter, Gregory standing tall near the entrance, his eyes fixed on me with unspoken pride. He raised his hand slightly, a nod of acknowledgement that spoke volumes. After the ceremony, I walked through the hallways of the new Evelyn's Promise headquarters, the walls lined with photographs of smiling students and framed letters of gratitude. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows, settling on the sills like delicate whispers of renewal. At the far end of the hall, the glass display case glimmered softly. I approached it, my breath fogging the surface as I stared at the pocket watch nestled inside. Its face gleamed under the light, ticking steadily, strong and unyielding. I rested my hand against the glass, the coolness seeping through my fingertips. I kept my promise, Evelyn, I whispered, my breath fogging the glass for just a moment before it cleared, leaving only the watch and its rhythmic ticking. Behind me, the soft laughter of children echoed through the hall, their footsteps light against the polished floor. I turned, watching as they darted past, their voices bright with hope. I smiled, slipping my hands into my pockets, feeling the weight of that letter against my fingertips. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white, pure, unblemished, and full of possibility. The snow outside Evelyn's promise fell softly, blanketing the world in quiet renewal. Through the glass case, my father's watch ticked steadily. No longer fractured, its surface polished and whole. I watched the hands move with purpose, each second a reminder that time, when respected, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes, the bridges we build are meant to collapse, not to destroy us, but to show us which ones are worth rebuilding. For me, that bridge was integrity, mended with patience and unyielding hope. Stonemont had been more than a battle for justice. It was proof that redemption is real and legacies can be rewritten. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story or join me as we continue building a community of resilience and hope.